All right, we will get started. I am Scott Kirk. I'm the manager of environmental compliance for Savannah River Remediation. Today is the fourth of 5 lectures as part of our internship lecture series. I'm pleased to announce that we have an outstanding speaker today. Barbara has been a good friend of mine and a colleague, just a respected professional for many years. And she will be talking about the lessons learned from the Fukushima nuclear accident. Let me introduce Barbara. Barbara Hamrick serves as the Radiation Safety Officer and Chief Health Physicist at the University of California, Irvine Health. Prior to joining the UCI Health team, Ms. Hamrick spent nearly 20 years as a health physicist in regulatory programs at the federal, state, and local levels, including the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the California Department of Health, and the Los Angeles County Office of Radiation Management. During her time with the CDPH, Ms. Hamrick served as the chair and of the organizations of Agreement State, as well as on numerous committees, working groups, and integrated materials performance evaluation program teams in conjunction with the NRC's Office of State and Tribal Programs. As a member of the Health Physics Society since 1998, Ms. Hamrick served on the board of directors. She was the secretary. She was also the president of the Health Physics Society. Ms. Hamrick continues to be active in the Health Physics Society and currently serves as a web operations editor-in-chief. Ms. Hamrick served on the US EPA's Radiation Advisory Committee from 2015 to 2021 and currently serves on the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. In addition to serving on the National Academy of Sciences Committee, the Lessons Learned for the Fukushima Accident Committee, she also served on the National Academy's Independent Assessment of the Science and Technology for the Department of Energy's Defense Environmental Cleanup Program Committee from 2017 to 2019. Ms. Hamrick's professional interests lie in acute and long-term health effects of radiation exposure, risk communication, and the intersection of science and administrative law. Ms. Hamrick received her law degree from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles in 1999 and a BS and an MS in physics from the University of California, Irvine in 1985 and 1987, respectively. She's a diplomat of the American Board of Health Physics and an active member of the California State Bar and a fellow of the Health Physics Society. With that, Barbara, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you especially for inviting me here. As Scott mentioned, we have known each other a long time, and I really look forward to working with him in the future. So before I get started on the talk, I want to talk a little bit about how I got into health physics and the lifetime of amazing work that it has provided for me. Back when I was a very little girl, I either wanted to be a ballerina or an astrophysicist. And not a whole lot changed in the 20 years following that. And I started out my education as a theater major at Western Washington University. But then I took a calculus class and I thought, gee, I really want more of that. So I ended up a physics major at the University of California, Irvine, where as Scott mentioned, I got a bachelor's and a master's. And at that time, the expectation was that I would go on to complete a PhD somewhere, then find a teaching appointment and stay in academia for life. And there's nothing wrong with that. We absolutely need people to do that. But I was more of a mind that I wanted to serve somehow. My grandmother had worked for the Social Security Administration for 25 years. Her brother served as a colonel in the U.S. Army, and I admired them both very much. And I thought that civil service was probably going to be the place for me. So I went to the library. Now, this was back in the days before the internet, and they had books there that I could look up government agencies that hired physicists. So I opened the physicist book and I randomly opened it to the ends, and I got the contact information for NASA, NOAA, NIST, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Civilian Navy. And I thought, okay, that's a good day's work. I'll write to them and see what happens. And about 7 days later, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission called me back and said, we'd like to interview you for a job in Chicago. Now, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, but I had been born in Chicago, and I thought that's going to be a great move. I'll go back there, and it'll be wonderful to see the city again. So I did get hired by them in the Chicago office, but I only ended up spending 2 years there because the Chicago winters, it turns out, are quite brutal when you're 32 compared to when you're 4 or 5 years old. So I came back to Los Angeles and I took a job with the Los Angeles County Office of Radiation Management. And the great thing about working for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was a lot of those 2 years were spent in intensive health physics training. Remember, I went into that with a straight up physics degree, and I really didn't know what health physics was until I joined the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I spent they gave me a lot of opportunities to learn and become involved in the field of health physics. I also became an active member of the Organization of Agreement States, the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors, and the Health Physics Society, where, as Scott mentioned, I was president from 2014 to 15. And it was through my involvement in those organizations that I had a lot of opportunities to travel. Also, I've been to China, to the Republic of Georgia, Argentina, South Africa, Scotland. They also opened up opportunities for me to work with the IAEA, and it was the HPS that supported my nomination to the National Academies Committee on Fukushima. So before I start into the topic, I just want to leave you with 2 points. And one is that government service is an absolutely wonderful opportunity for people who are entering the workforce. And there are dozens of federal agencies, hundreds of state and local agencies that hire health physicists, and hundreds that need scientists across the board, all across the country. We need physicists, chemists, mathematicians, engineers, biologists, um, getting out there and doing the real work of science. And the second thing is, do get involved with professional organizations. They give you wonderful networking opportunities to do what you want to do, what you find most interesting. And so those 2 points. One is, think about government service and get involved in the professional organizations in your field. So, as Scott mentioned, I am also a lawyer. I got interested in that while working for the regulatory agencies because they seemed to have a lot of power, and I was interested in how all that worked. So I went to Loyola, and I'm going to start out then with something that's a little lawyerish. This is my disclaimer. The presentation reflects upon the work that was performed by the National Academies. However, what's going to follow are my personal thoughts and does not represent any official interpretation of the report or any official position of the Academy. So with that out of the way, we'll get to something a little more human-like. At 2:46 p.m. Japan Standard Time, on March 11th, 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake struck. 41 minutes later, it was followed by a massive tsunami, the likes of which had not been seen in almost 1,000 years. Together, these events took the lives of over 15,000 people. Many thousands more were injured, lost their family and friends, lost homes and businesses, and at least 600 of the ill and the elderly lost their lives during the evacuation. There were no acute fatalities attributable to the radiation. So before we discuss the events at Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Station, I just want to take a moment to reflect on those who lost their lives that day. Thank you. I think it's important that we acknowledge the true tragedy of that day before we start embarking on the analysis of the less catastrophic, though still serious, accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. As a little background, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the National Academies of Sciences were chartered by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863. They were charged with providing independent, objective advice to the nation on matters related to science and technology. I was quite fortunate. I consider myself very fortunate to have been selected to serve on this committee, and I only hope that my contribution to the report is commensurate with the benefits I received. The first official report of our committee was issued in July 2014. We did not complete our full charge in that report, and the phase 2 report was subsequently issued in May of 2016. The first phase dealt with the accident itself and with health and safety issues. The second phase covers security and spent fuel storage issues. I originally wrote much of this presentation for a meeting of the Canadian Radiation Protection Association in 2015. At that time and now, there are a lot of different roads I could have taken in explaining this report. I could have brought the complete findings and recommendations from the committee to you and sort of put my spin on them. Or I could have walked you through all the amazing resources we had at our disposal to work on this report. But I decided that I was going to stick with what I know and share the highlights of the journey from my relative to my experience as a health physicist and a regulator. So I'm intending to focus on the emergency response portion of the report because that is where I had the greatest experience. And all the committee members, when you serve on these committees, all the committee members ultimately contribute to the writing of the report. They all have to ultimately agree on what the report says. And usually people will gravitate to their special area of expertise, but everybody gets involved in every aspect of the report. Chapter 6 of the July 2014 report provides a detailed discussion of the off-site response, the communications problems that were encountered, the lack of information they had to deal with to make predictions or evacuation decisions, the challenges associated with those evacuations, and the impact of the frequently changing dose and contamination guidelines. Japan, like the US, had requirements for reactors to develop emergency response plans in the event of a nuclear incident. And those plans, like the US, cover both on-site and off-site response. But the big difference between the Japanese and the US model was that in the US, all emergencies start local. They start at the local level and then the local authorities, state authorities move up to the chain to ask for additional resources as needed. Whereas in Japan, the response is guided from the top down. And they begin with the public notice of a nuclear emergency and include evacuation orders and other protective action orders that filter down from the national level to the local, eventually to the local level. Now, it's my opinion that it really didn't matter which way the arrows went in this case. Those arrows represent both communications and the infrastructure that's available to respond. And this response was undertaken in the most severe of circumstances. The committee actually put in their report that this event was completely off the map. So there were a lot of impediments to this response, impediments that wouldn't have been encountered in the types of emergencies that are normally planned for. These included the widespread power outages, the challenges to the communication infrastructure, many highways and bridges were impassable, and emergency and medical personnel were already engaged in a major response to the earthquake and the tsunami. So all of those resources were taxed completely to their maximum already. These are some of the images that followed. You can see up in the top left corner tsunami actually coming onto land, and some of the damage in Miyagi, Iwate, and Fukushima. The epicenter was off the coast really of Miyagi, north of the Fukushima plants, but impacted all three of these prefectures. Hundreds of miles of coastline were inundated by the tsunami. The fact that the response was as successful as it was is a testament to the resiliency, bravery, diligence, and innovation of the Japanese people. And it is my opinion that the response was quite successful. That's not to say there were not problems. The major findings of the report enumerate some of those issues that were found, which impacted the response activities. So as noted, there was a lack of information on the plant status. When the earthquake struck, all the units at Fukushima Daiichi lost off-site power. However, the diesel generators started as expected. Oops, I got a little off my slides here. I should really be on this one. They lost off-site power. The diesel generators started up as they were supposed to do. 41 minutes later, then the tsunami hits, and the diesel generators and the battery backup sources for units 1 through 5 were either rendered unusable because of direct damage to them, or they were unable to provide power because the electrical distribution panels were deluged. They were below sea level at that point. So this left very few options to be able to monitor the plant status. Not only were monitoring instruments unavailable, valve position indicators, other equipment was left without power to function or to communicate their readings remotely to the control room. The plant staff was quite literally in the dark themselves. They had not completed a plant walkdown after the earthquake before the tsunami hit, so they did not have a full picture of the damage to the plant. Following the tsunami, areas in the turbine buildings and the lower portions of units 1 and 2 were inaccessible due to the flooding. So under these circumstances, with the darkness, the unknown extent of damage, and the inaccessibility of their critical equipment, it made the prospect of finding and inspecting instrumentation and valves and other equipment extremely perilous for the persons in the plant. This is not the situation that is generally used for emergency planning purposes. In the US, emergency plans rely heavily on the fact that an accident will be relatively slow to develop, that primary systems will be available, and they will be functioning to control the reactor and to predict the progression of the accident, to project off-site doses, and to prepare to take mitigating actions. But as the NAS report bluntly stated, the accident was off the map, and none of those things were available to be able to make decisions about the potential for release, what mitigating actions could be taken, and what to do for the populations nearby. Not only were the plant communications inhibited, that is, the instrumentation couldn't communicate to the control room couldn't control certain elements of the plant operations, the plant could not communicate off-site for some time, and the government layers had a lot of difficulty communicating amongst one another. And in one case, I think I have later, they were trying to notify a local area that not everybody had received potassium iodide as a protective action. But the local emergency center was in the process of actually moving because of the damage to the building they were in. The evacuations started relatively early. On March 11th, at about 8:50 p.m. local time, so some 6 to 7 hours after the accident, The Fukushima prefecture issued a 2-kilometer evacuation order. But less than an hour later, the national government issued a 3-kilometer evacuation order. These orders were issued independent of one another and not based on any projected or known release. They were precautionary. And given the complete lack of information about the plant status, they were doing this as simply a precautionary measure. In addition, they issued a shelter-in-place order for those people between 3 to 10 kilometers out from the plant at the same time. And on March 12th, the evacuation order was increased to the full 10-kilometer radius in the morning, and then to 20 kilometers later that afternoon after the first hydrogen explosion occurred. And that evacuation on March 12th in the afternoon affected about 78,000 people. These orders coming as they did, one on top of the other, with changing area limits, caused a lot of concern in the population, and also caused the population quite a bit of distrust. They want firm answers, firm recommendations, and there just wasn't the information available to make recommendations that would remain in place for as long as needed. 2 days later, on March 14th, the National Emergency Operations Center was notified. This is the story of the KI. They were notified that a particular evacuation zone had not been evacuated. And in particular, those that were institutionalized in that evacuation area had not been moved out. In part, that was due to the fact that they didn't have medical transportation vehicles and that the medical expertise that they needed were otherwise occupied caring for the injured from the tsunami and earthquake. So they ordered at that time for them to take KI, the potassium iodide. But as I mentioned earlier, the local emergency operations center was down. They were in the process of moving because of damage to their building. And so ultimately, they did not receive that order. Further complicating matters, on March 16th, the US Department of State issued an advisory to all Americans in Japan to evacuate the area out to 80 kilometers. This caused an enormous amount of distress and confusion among the Japanese leaders and the Japanese citizens. Their recommendation, recall, was out to 20 kilometers, and now the US was saying Americans need to go out to 80 kilometers or 50 miles. That's the planning zone, emergency planning zone, or the for the US. You've got the 10-mile zone and the 50-mile zone, and that is equivalent to 80 kilometers. The recommendation was based on an overly conservative, on two to four, depending on where you read the information, 2 to 4 overly conservative estimates of release in 2 different scenarios that the NRC had prepared. The first scenario assumed 100% core melt in Unit 2 with open containment. The second assumed multiple unit failures and 100% damage to the unit for spent fuel pool. Interestingly, that 80 kilometers or 50 miles was not selected because it was safe beyond that area, or that the radiation would be reduced sufficiently beyond that area, but because the software they use to do the dose estimates off-site only goes out to 50 miles. And so at that 50-mile mark, they were still above the levels at which the NRC would have recommended evacuation orders, and so they used that. So it was overly conservative, and it was based, the limit wasn't actually a scientifically based limit. It was just the limitations of the program that was used to do that evaluation. A lot of this is detailed in transcripts at the NRC's agency-wide document access and management system known as ADAMS. Somebody put in a FOIA request for the transcript of what was going on at the headquarters operations office during the entire accident. And so it lays out some of it's redacted, but it's very readable, and it does lay out just how much they did not know about the accident and the speculation that went on about the spent fuel pool in Unit 4. It was very interesting reading. Anybody can download it. I didn't get that because I was on the committee. I just went to the NRC's site and searched for the transcripts from those dates. So it was, if you're interested in that sort of thing, it makes for some very interesting reading on how decision making goes in a crisis. So in addition to all the difficulties they had that I just talked about, there were several papers published in the timeframe 2012 to 2014 as we were writing our report, describing the evacuations of the institutionalized populations and the elderly. And one estimation reported 109 excess deaths in this population. I've seen reports of up to 1,800, close to 2,000 excess deaths as a result of the evacuation of the ill and elderly. And the most common cause of death in those reports was pneumonia, due to the very low temperatures, the poor nutrition during transport, because there was a lot of time spent waiting in the vehicles for readmission to another facility in a safer place. The appropriate transport vehicles were scarce. They utilized other vehicles, school buses. The ones that were available were overcrowded. And to make matters even worse, many of the facilities that they designated these elderly people to be transported to were denying them admission because of their fear that these people were contaminated and would contaminate their facility. And all of this didn't occur because of the poor planning. Again, these vehicles and medical staff were not available because they were already responding to the earthquake and tsunami. Despite all of this, the report, the NAS report, notes that the protective actions issued during the accident were generally successful due to a combination of good execution by the organizations involved, improvisation, and just good luck. And good luck in this case refers to the fact that about 80% of the radioactivity released was actually released out over the Pacific Ocean. Nevertheless, according to UNSCEAR, evacuation still reduced doses to that population by up to a factor of 10. The World Health Organization concluded that the increases in the incidence of human disease attributable to the additional radiation exposure from Fukushima Daiichi are likely to remain below detectable levels. And just for some comparisons, we can look at what was the difference between Chernobyl and Fukushima. As you can see, the total iodine released was estimated to be 5 to 25% at Fukushima relative to the Chernobyl release. And of course, the fraction that went over land was very different. About 80% went over the Pacific Ocean after the Fukushima Daiichi accident, whereas with Chernobyl, about 100% went over land. And the Japanese initiated their evacuations much earlier. They interdicted food and water earlier. And rather fortuitously, the Japanese have a high amount of stable iodine in their diet, whereas the people of Ukraine have a much lower amount of stable iodine in their diet. And stable iodine is, of course, somewhat protective against radioactive iodine uptake in the thyroid tissue. So based on all of this, there was a lot of reason to be optimistic about the outcome of this accident, or the impact that it would have on the population. So in part, the optimism has been borne out. The thyroid ultrasound examination program in Fukushima began on October 9th, 2011, so about 7 months after the accident, with the aim of screening children at the age of 18 and below who had lived in or were visiting the prefecture at the time of the nuclear reactor accident. Participation in this program was voluntary, but over 300,000 children signed up for the program, and these studies are ongoing even as we speak. Looking at the data, they are still screening children as well. Various researchers have come to significantly different conclusions about the findings regarding the possible screening effect. That is, if you look for thyroid cancers, you will find them. There are many thyroid cancers that remain indolent. That is, they never become clinically significant. But if you are screening for them at the microscopic level, you will see them. Other researchers have concluded there is some attribution, some increase, but as of 2020, that's the last data I could find on this, the total number of definite or suspected thyroid cancer cases was about 240 out of 300,000 children. And when I say definite or suspected thyroid cases, I'm not, that is not also saying they were attributable to the radiation, but that those are confirmed thyroid cancer cases. And as I said, there is still discussion and research ongoing as to how much is due to the screening effect. Owing to the difficulty in estimating individualized thyroid doses, that is, they did not have, they didn't have the values of actual uptakes in the children's thyroids. So there are all kinds of surrogates that are being used to estimate what the exposure was. But that makes dose assignment very difficult. And there have been various dose estimates by WHO and by UNSCARE, but there is still no definitive answer, no dose-related impact that can be specifically identified with a specific amount of dose in these cases. And that is also part of the reason they can't be attributed necessarily to any radiation exposure. So finally, I want to mention, I want to talk about one of the findings in chapter 6. Actually, these have all been parts of the findings of chapter 6, all these issues. This one was with respect to the offsite actions, and there was a lot of confusion and distrust engendered by the changing radiation standards during and after the accident. So not only because of the changing evacuation status for people around the plant, but also for actual standards that were being used to identify people who needed to be contaminated and what actions should be taken. So the pre-accident guidelines, the ones that were in place in the plan, in some cases they found out were too conservative. That is, they simply were, the contamination levels were so conservative as to not be useful, because everybody was contaminated basically at this very low level that they had initially set in the planning. And in other cases, especially with respect to children, they found that their criteria, for example, for interdiction of food and water, was not restrictive enough for children. So the public wanted to know, of course, the public is demanding, well, just tell us what the safe level is. I think any health physicist, I'm sure Scott has felt this pressure before of, well, just tell me what is safe. And scientists generally don't want to answer that question, but it's a question we all need to be able to discuss realistically in emergency situations such as this. So in the case of the contamination criteria, they were established for screening evacuees, and they found that their level was 13,000 CPM, counts per minute, using a standard pancake GM. Excuse me. And as I said, they found that was simply too low to be useful because too many people were exceeding this criteria. So they increased that threshold to 100,000 CPM. So that's almost a tenfold increase. And that didn't set well with the members of the public. Their perception had been that 13,000 CPM had been safe. And now they were being told, well, 100,000 is safe. So that engendered some distrust. On the other hand, the provisional limits for contaminated food and water were set at keeping the dose below 5 millisieverts per year. And that was later revised downward to 1 millisievert per year, number one, because they found they could do that, and because they felt that was more protective for the children in the population who still had to eat and drink the food. In this case, the public was concerned because they were told the higher limit was safe. And then later, they were implicitly told that higher limit is not safe. We have to go down to this lower limit. So it's important that that as health physicists, if you do go into that field, we understand it really doesn't matter whether we're changing up or down. That we need to relay the limits that we're using, the reasons for them as clearly as possible, and it is always going to cause concern in the population. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. By many accounts, as I said, when the limits were revised upward, the public didn't trust what they were being told, didn't believe the new limit was safe. When they were revised downward, they felt they had previously been lied to. So it was essentially like the 1957 movie, Witness for the Prosecution. Were you lying to me then, or are you lying to me now? These issues have continued into the recovery phase from this accident. And I'm certain that in the US, we can expect the same in the aftermath of a major incident involving the release of radioactive material. The US EPA provides protective action guidelines for emergencies involving the dispersion of radioactive materials. These guidelines are contained in the PAG manual, Protective Action Guideline Manual, and they specifically exclude specific limits or dose goals for resettlement. That is, they have dose limits and dose goals for evacuations, for shelter in place. They make recommendations on what to do in that immediate and intermediate phase after the accident. But for the long-term phase, they basically advise that a process should be developed, including all stakeholders, to make decisions about resettlement after the event. Now, it's always been a personal opinion of mine, and I am not against stakeholder engagement. I am very much in favor of it, but we need to do that prior to the event. We need to have some resettlement guidelines for communities, and understanding that you can't sit down with every community. There does need to be some discussion about what is going to be acceptable in the future. And then if individuals and communities, decide at the time of the accident that they would rather relocate themselves, then I think that is an option for them to have. But I think that we do need some kind of guideline in place for resettlement before we have tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people displaced from their homes, from their businesses, children not being able to attend school. I think it doesn't make sense to then try and undertake what is likely to be a 2 or 3 year process to decide what limits are acceptable to allow a population back into an area. So we're now 10 years out from those events, and they have been slowly returning to restricted areas. That began at the national level in Japan in about 2014, so 2 years out from the accident. Some individual municipalities had allowed earlier returns. Almost 200,000 people total had been displaced in the first 30 days after the event, and now about 125,000 have been allowed to return. As of January of 2019, 35,000 still could not return to their former homes, and 40,000 chose not to return. As I end this, I would like to focus on a story that got very little press, but did receive attention from our committee, and it's the story of the Onagawa nuclear power station in the Miyagi prefecture. As I showed in the picture before, I think, and you can see here, the epicenter near Miyagi prefecture was much closer to the Onagawa plant than it was to Fukushima, and the tsunami height was equal or greater than that experienced at Fukushima. Like Fukushima Daiichi and Fukushima Daini, Onagawa was on the Pacific coast. However, the plant had a very different experience than Fukushima Daiichi. Onagawa lost 4 of the 5 power lines that provided offsite power and was hit with a tsunami of the same size or greater in some cases. But from sea level to the main site elevation at the Onagawa was 14 meters, just 1 meter more than the peak tsunami height there. So the tsunami did sadly devastate the surrounding town of Ishinomaki, which I have a picture of later. This is a photograph in Onagawa of the high water mark. This is the entrance, the emergency room entrance to the hospital in the city. This is in and you can see how close they are to water, but this was the high water mark from the tsunami there. This shows the devastation in the surrounding city. There were 3,000 deaths in Ishinomaki, about 20% of the death toll nationwide. So they were hit extremely hard. However, the Onagawa nuclear power station remained intact, and it had power. And it was the only light for miles around, and hundreds of people in the surrounding areas sought refuge there. They provided shelter in their gymnasium. They provided food, water, telephones, blankets. They provided clothing. They provided a helicopter to take one pregnant woman to a hospital in Sendai to give birth. The residents were welcomed there, and they stayed there for nearly 3 months. We were fortunate enough to also be able to visit the Onagawa nuclear power plant. We also visited Fukushima Daiichi during our service on the committee, and we met with the wonderful people at both of the plants. So I'd like to close with a couple of quotes from our first final report. It is not the committee's intention to place blame for the accident or to find fault with how personnel responded to the earthquake and tsunami. With the benefit of hindsight, it is easy to second guess the decisions and actions taken. The committee came to appreciate the overwhelming challenges that plant personnel faced. Personnel responded with courage and resilience in the face of harsh circumstances. Their actions likely reduced the severity of the accident and the magnitude of the offsite releases. the conditions at the Fukushima Daiichi plant following the earthquake and the tsunami would have challenged any nuclear plant operator. And I thank you. So let me end this presentation. How do I stop sharing? There we go. No. I can't stop sharing. Oh, there it is. Big orange button. Got it.
So Barbara, this is Scott. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Excellent. That was an outstanding presentation.
I'm going to take a quick drink of water here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you.
Barbara, as I told you from the outset, I've asked each of our presenters to share what the most important piece of advice that you can share with our interns to better ensure that their careers are going to be rewarding and successful. And I think you answered that right from the outset. And that was joining like a scientific professional organization. I'll elaborate more on that next week. But I think it also underscores the message that you had about the importance of government service. So I think those words are very important, and I can't agree more.
Well, thank you.
My question to you, though, is about the National Academy of Sciences report. Most of the time, or frequently, those reports originate because it's directed by Congress, and it has a purpose, and the recommendations and the findings are supposed to be used for a certain purpose. So can you give us some details about the report itself, who it was distributed to, and maybe some of the impacts it could have had? Because I think that's really important to see if we can, if you can share that with us.
You know, I wasn't expecting that question, and so if you don't mind, am I getting an echo?
Yes. Hold.
Are we back now? No.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Can you hear me now? No, I lost you. Give me one
No, he
second.
can hear you.
Okay.
He's just muting.
Give me one second. I'm actually going to grab the report.
Oh, yes, please.
So yes, you are correct. I just hadn't, as I said, hadn't been expecting this. It was the U.S. Congress asked the National Academies of Sciences to examine the causes of the accident in Fukushima and to identify lessons learned from the accident, from the response to the accident, and very specifically also asked about the security and the safety of the spent fuel pools, which, as I said, we didn't get to until the second phase of the study, but they were very concerned about that. The results of the reports are available to anyone. There is a on the report on the spent fuel pools. There is a portion of the report that only went to Congress. There's some security pieces that were not made public. So, but the health and safety report, which is really what's covered in the first one, was completely public. And it's one of the most downloaded reports of all their reports on the website. So we felt very pleased with that result.
That's just outstanding. I'm going to ask our interns here at the Savannah Riverside if they have any questions. And I'm looking across the audience here. Any questions? Yes, Allison.
Numbers basically and how they kept changing. How do you create a sense of security for the public while also trying to do your job as a physicist, scientist, during an emergency like that?
I couldn't hear
Barbara,
the
did you hear
question.
that question?
No, I
No,
can't. I
we couldn't
couldn't
hear.
quite hear it.
You know, Allison, why don't you come up here? We'll be able to, and for the rest of the interns too, please come up so I make sure that your question is understood and I can get you an answer.
Can repeat it.
No, you can.
So I just wanted to know, as a scientist, a physicist, for the public, how do you create a sense of security for them during an emergency situation like that when all the numbers keep changing? I was just wondering if you came up with a strategy for that to make sure that they felt safe and secure during that situation.
Well, actually, the Academy, the report recommends coming up with that. Somebody should come up with that strategy. This is a problem. You know, I've worked in the government for 20 years, and this has been a consistent problem. And it's well recognized by the scientists. And the scientists aren't always the greatest ones to be communicating things. And we do, I mean, for emergency planning purposes, the states and local agencies and the NRC, they all have pre-planned messages and that hopefully, you know, will work in these situations. But number one, in this accident, it was so much more severe than anybody had planned for. So that it did require, you know, some alteration of what they were going to do as the accident was ongoing, which is always problematic. But in addition to that, even it just communicating this kind of risk with the public is challenging, even in circumstances where there's not an immediate threat. I mean, I've done, when I worked for California Department of Public Health, I went to a lot of meetings about sites cleaning up, decommissioning sites. And the public, you know, always expressed their concern there about what's going to be left behind and how it's going to impact their lives and their families. And to be honest with you, sometimes it was quite frustrating because it's difficult. It's difficult to be able to explain how you can never say, oh, there's going to be zero risk. We don't say, scientists don't say that. There's never zero risk. So there's a tension between, you know, what the reality of science says and the kind of comfort that the public wants to hear. I don't know how to resolve that either, but the Academy said you guys need to figure this out. So
It's a question, Allison.
it was a good question.
What I'm going to do right now, Barbara, is we're going to take questions from the audience that are online, and I'm going to turn this over to Keith Leiner.
No, I don't have any questions here.
And I'm going to turn this over to Keith to field the questions for you. And then when we finish with the questions and answers, I'll close it up.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the folks out in the audience there, if you just like kind of raise your hand and then I can call on you. I can. I don't
So
see
Keith, this
anything
is
in
Heatherly
there.
Dukes. I keep doing my hand, but I don't think you can see it. So I'll just ask a quick question. So Barbara, very informative presentation. I was actually over in Japan right after the accident occurred and can attest the pictures don't even really tell the story of how devastating that accident was. And so my question to you is, because it was such an extraordinary natural events that happened, if that were to happen on the coast of the United States, let's say California, and we have power plants there as well, how do you think our reactors would fare in comparison to what happened at Japan? And then besides the reactors, which I think I know what your answer will be, but from an emergency response standpoint and evacuation standpoint, how do you think the United States would compare today in comparison to the Japanese 10 years ago?
Well, I think that, I mean, if we postulate an accident or a natural events that are as severe as occurred there, I think we would see a very similar events. I think that the damage of the earthquake actually was mitigated with the diesel power generation. It wasn't until the tsunami flooded the power distribution network that they completely lost power. Now there was damage from the earthquake, and we don't know because they couldn't do a plant walkout. But I think the plants would have been sustainable, but for that following tsunami. And so, one of the lessons learned is you have to have redundant power distribution systems above ground, so that doesn't happen. Now, I don't know if that's the case. Right now, the only power station we have left is operating station we have left in California is Diablo Canyon up near San Luis Obispo. So they are on the ocean. I don't know what their tsunami history is. In this case, for the tsunami in Japan, it literally was a 1,000-year event that occurred. So that's not to say that you can't plan for those. And Onagawa actually did plan for that. So, which is why their seawall was a meter higher, and they were relatively safe from the accident. So in terms of the plant functioning and failures, I think we would see very similar things in the US. In terms of how the population would respond, again, because our planning guidelines are very similar to what Japan used, we might see a similar response there during the evacuation phase, and definitely 100% during the resettlement phase, because we still don't have real resettlement plans. We're planning to do that on an ad hoc basis post-accident, which, as I mentioned, doesn't make sense to me. So I mean, I think we would see similar reactions and impacts as we saw at Fukushima Daiichi. Thank you for that question.
Thanks, Barbara. We have an Andrew Sanfilippo or something like that. So go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you talked a lot about the response and sort of the doses that came out of it, but I was hoping you could give a little more detail on what happened, like at a site level, like what failures happened, what caused all the issues to go out, beyond just all the loss of communication, electricity, and so on.
Well, I mean, the major thing was when they lost the power. So as I mentioned, they completely lost off-site power. They had 5 lines of off-site power coming in, and when the earthquake hit, that took out all the power at the site. Subsequent to that, the diesel generators kicked in, and so they were restoring the functions. But it was only within 41 minutes after the earthquake that the tsunami hit. And when the tsunami flooded the power distribution panels down in the basement areas, they had diesel generators that were flooded also, but they had 2 diesel generators that continued to work. They were a part of units 5 and 6. But all that power distribution still went through the basement. And so they didn't have any way to immediately reestablish power. And that was really one of the biggest problems. Subsequent to that, then they had the hydrogen buildup in unit 3. And now I don't recall 3. I think 3 and 1 and 4, which eventually caused explosions there, causing further damage. I didn't go into all those details. The report does go into all those details, and we certainly evaluated all of those causes. I focused on the emergency response because, as I said, that my history as a regulator, that's where I had the most experience, and I could do another 2-hour talk, I think, on the causes and the engineering issues related. But you can download the report for free in PDF form at the NAS website. So thank you for that question.
Quint Gordon has a question. Go ahead, Quint.
Hi, I was wondering what field of law you studied and how you think that helped further your career as a scientist.
Good question. So as I said, I got interested in law because I was working for an administrative agency, and they seem to have a lot of power. And so when you study law, at least when I studied law, which was in 1996 to 2000, I was in a 4-year program at night. And there's not a specialty that you, at least at that time, I don't know if law schools have changed since then. So I had the broad spectrum. You take all the standard courses, torts, constitutional law. I took a lot of courses in legislation and administrative law because that was kind of what my focus was and what I was interested in understanding. I did briefly entertain the idea of going to work as a lawyer for one of the environmental agencies, but I was torn. I really loved the physics work that I did on a day-to-day basis, and so I didn't want to walk away from that. I think one of the great things that law school did for me is it definitely teaches you how to write, and it teaches you how to communicate ideas in writing very clearly, in a very orderly manner, very systematic manner. And I think that was very helpful in my technical writing. It also gave me the opportunity to, I joined in the moot court competition. I hated speaking in public, but this gave me a very structured opportunity to kind of do it in a safe environment amongst my law school friends. So I think that was very helpful to me. And just to have a better understanding of how the laws function, and especially how the administrative agencies function and interact with one another. I think that's helped. So a lot of scientist lawyers go into patent law. I just wasn't interested in that, but that is a large and lucrative field to go into with a law and science background. So thank you.
With that, Barbara, we're going to wrap it up. But what I'd like to say, first of all, is thank you so much. That was an outstanding presentation. Those were very good questions that we got from the audience. And again, we are recording this presentation, and we've created a YouTube channel that we put all the SRR summer internship lecture series on. And we do that as a way that we can continue to use it as a training mechanism, but we hope you guys use it. And next week, we will conclude the second annual internship lecture series. Barbara, I'm going to be presenting also on the need to serve scientific professional organizations and also public service. And I'm going to be talking about some of the work that you helped me with. And that was the legislation that we helped move forward and at least influence. And that had to do with the implementation of the IAEA Code of Conduct. And I hope that you join us because I'd like your insights on it these many years later after that occurred.
I remember that very well. It was some great work you got done.
Well, you were very instrumental. So thank you guys very much. And we will conclude this internship lecture series today. Take care.